Two children were playing a game, completely unaware of the eerie figures flickering outside the sliding glass door. The world had been overrun by zombies, a post-apocalyptic nightmare that had lasted for 6 years. Remarkably, this brother and sister had managed to survive in an isolated villa all this time, something very few could have accomplished. The dangers they faced were far greater than anyone could imagine. One day, a couple drove up to the villa. Jim greeted them while holding a toy gun. The man immediately asked, "Where are your parents?" Jim stayed silent, but the man simply smiled and said, "See you next time." That night, Jim locked all the doors and windows tightly. Outside, a few zombies lingered, waiting for any chance to break in. By morning, they were still safe. Jim checked the bullets in the magazine, and it turned out the toy gun wasn't so ordinary after all. As the siblings went outside to play as usual, the same pickup truck from the day before pulled up again. This time, the couple's attitude was much firmer. They repeated their question, asking where the children's parents were. Jim lied, claiming they had gone into town to gather supplies. But two grown adults weren't fooled by such a small trick. The woman smiled warmly and said the town was several hours away. She promised they could protect Jim and his sister until their parents returned. Seeing the house stocked with supplies and even a working refrigerator, the couple quickly decided to stay for a while. The man, Jack, said he would hide the car outside. It seemed as though they were running from someone and trying to avoid being caught. Late that night, Jim overheard the couple talking. They sounded very pleased with the villa. For safety, he and his sister slipped into their safe room, the secret that had kept them alive all this time. The next morning, Jack was already making breakfast, clearly acting like he owned the place. Jim kept a calm face but made an odd remark. "It will be over before you know it." When night fell, Jim suddenly asked, "Is it time?" His dog sniffed him and gave a barely noticeable nod. Without hesitation, Jim scooped up his sister and locked her safely inside the safe room. Downstairs, the couple was still wrapped up in their own world, unaware that danger was about to strike. The woman excused herself, saying she needed to use the bathroom. But when she glanced outside, she spotted several zombies crouching near the window. She quickly turned off the lights, thinking they wouldn't see her. Suddenly, the door behind her swung open. Jack sensed something was wrong, drew his gun, and rushed over, only to find his girlfriend lying on the floor, covered in blood. That was the last anyone ever saw of the couple. Meanwhile, Jim and his sister carried on playing as if nothing had happened. Clearly, this wasn't the first time they had dealt with human intruders. At that moment, a long-haired man was trekking through the forest. He spotted several traps in the snow and soon traced them back to the villa. Suddenly, a little girl appeared in front of him. Before he could react, a sharp sting hit his neck. He had been struck with a tranquilizer dart. Of course, it was Jim who had fired it. Their survival skills were remarkable. When the man finally woke from the effects of the drug, Jim was already waiting with his gun in hand. After some questioning, the man revealed his name was Dan, a passing Special Forces soldier on a mission to find his wife up north. Jim paused. There was something different about this man. Unlike others, Dan didn't want their food or medicine. He only wanted his weapon back. Seizing the opportunity, Jim made a deal. Dan would help power the villa. Curious, Dan asked where Jim's parents were. This time, Jim didn't lie. He explained that his father was a scientist who had been missing for a long time, and his mother was a security agent who had recently gone on a mission and should be back soon. Dan was stunned when he saw the treadmill powering the house. He hadn't expected the villa to rely on someone literally running to generate electricity. Suddenly, a zombie approached the window. Without hesitation, Dan grabbed a nearby discus and charged outside to confront it. After dealing with the zombie, Dan returned covered in blood. Jim shouted, "Why did you have to kill it? The windows are made from special bulletproof glass. No zombie can get inside." Despite the scolding, Dan felt sorry for the siblings and willingly got on the treadmill, powering the house manually. The night passed quietly, and by the end, Dan was nearly exhausted. At some point, Jim's little sister wandered over, circled him a few times, shouted, "You stink," and ran off. Dan went to the bathroom to wash up, and the thoughtful little girl even brought him a hairpin. By then, Jim had already left the villa. Every morning, he checked the traps around the area to keep the zombie horde at bay. Sure enough, another lively zombie had been caught in one of the traps. Meanwhile, after finishing breakfast inside the villa, Dan decided to visit the place where Jim's mother worked. On the desk, beside a photo, he spotted a car key. Excited, Dan rushed to the garage, only to find the car was broken down. At that moment, A room tucked away in the corner caught his attention. Thinking it was just a storage room, he was about to check it out, but Jim stopped him sharply. After spending more than a day together, the siblings were convinced that Dan wasn't a threat, so they no longer retreated to the safe room at night. Yet, strangely, Jim handcuffed himself before going to sleep. As dawn approached, Dan was woken by footsteps outside. It was Jim, already on his patrol. He returned to the trap from the previous day, where the zombie was still caught but hadn't yet been dealt with. As Jim pondered what to do, Dan suddenly appeared. Instinctively, Dan thought the zombie might be Jim's mother and was about to put her out of her misery, but Jim raised his gun and stopped him just in time. Frustrated, Dan stormed back to the villa and opened the storage room he had been forbidden to enter the day before. Inside, he found a blanket on the floor and walls covered with deep, terrifying scratch marks, clearly a place used to keep zombies locked up. The discovery only strengthened his suspicions. Suddenly, the roar of an engine echoed outside. More survivors had arrived, and they clearly meant trouble. They circled the villa with guns drawn, scanning the area. Unarmed, Dan stayed perfectly still, unwilling to make a move. Meanwhile, Jim, returning from his patrol, watched from a distance. His little sister stood at the second-floor window, waving frantically. Just as the intruders were about to spot her, Dan appeared out of nowhere and pulled her away. Jim let out a long sigh of relief. Seeing the doors and windows firmly locked, the intruders eventually gave up and drove off. After that close call, Jim trusted Dan even more and returned his weapon to him. Dan felt it was time to leave, but found himself strangely reluctant to go. In the middle of the night, he was woken by the voice of his wife calling to him in a dream. When he awoke, Dan made an important decision. He would take Jim and his sister with him to search for his wife. That way, he could pursue his own mission while also protecting the siblings. Jim didn't hesitate for a second. He refused Dan's offer. He was determined to stay and wait for his mother's return. But before the discussion could go further, loud noises erupted outside. The gang of robbers from the day before had come back with reinforcements. To make matters worse, they had taken Jim's little sister while she was playing outside. As tensions escalated and both sides faced off, a few gunshots suddenly rang out. Two of the robbers collapsed instantly. Dan rushed forward and managed to rescue the girl. The shooter was none other than Jim's mother, Melanie. But in the chaos, Dan was struck in the chest by a bullet from one of the remaining attackers. He collapsed, powerless and unconscious. No one knew how much time had passed before Dan finally woke. To his shock, the gunshot wound in his chest had completely healed. Yet he found himself tied to a post with thick rope. Upstairs, Jim and his family were waving at him continuously. Still confused, Dan made his way inside, where Melanie revealed the truth. She explained that ordinary infected people lost their brain function and were driven only by the basic urge to feed. But there was another kind, special, infected, whose brains remained fully functional, just like normal humans, while also inheriting the physical advantages of zombies, including the ability to heal from any wound or illness. The catch was that these special infected suffered a severe drawback. After sustaining serious injuries, or simply over time, they would enter an uncontrollable state of rage known as frenzy, during which they became indistinguishable from ordinary zombies. After hearing her explanation, Dan finally understood. Could he really be one of these special infected? Melanie nodded. Otherwise, he would never have survived the gunshot. A normal person would have died or turned into a mindless zombie. The fact that he had only gone through a brief frenzy and then woken up unharmed was proof enough. Then Melanie revealed an even more shocking truth. Jim was also a special infected, just like Dan. The couple Jim had killed that night had been victims of his uncontrollable frenzy. That explained why Jim handcuffed himself before sleeping every night. Curious, Dan asked if there was a way to predict when a frenzy would occur. Melanie explained that Jim's dog had been specially trained to detect subtle changes in scent just before it happened. That's when Dan remembered the room full of claw marks, the very place Jim stayed during his frenzies. Suddenly, another engine roared nearby. Melanie, holding her daughter, was facing off against a group of militiamen. She seemed to know the white-bearded leader well. His daughter had run off with a shady man, and he had been searching for them with his group. Melanie assured him that if she found any trace of them, she would let him know immediately. Reluctantly, the old man led his men away. That night, Dan casually asked about the history of the villa. Melanie explained that the National Security Agency had long anticipated the zombie outbreak. In remote locations like this one, they had secretly built thousands of shelters, fully reinforced with sturdy materials and equipped with independent power systems, designed to be completely self-sufficient. Hearing this, Dan felt a pang of regret. He thought Melanie should have warned others earlier. Perhaps it might have saved countless lives. But Melanie could only shake her head helplessly. She revealed that both Jim and his sister suffered from congenital heart conditions. Jim's father, a biologist and one of the first scholars to discover the zombie virus, knew his son wouldn't live past the age of 3. In a desperate attempt to save him, he injected Jim with the virus himself, unintentionally turning him into a special infected. Tragically, when Jim entered his first frenzy, his father was bitten and failed to survive the ordeal, becoming a regular zombie. Melanie had no choice but to put him down herself. After hearing this heartbreaking story, Dan couldn't help but admire Melanie's strength and determination. She was always focused on doing everything she could to protect her small family. Over time, Melanie and her children began to trust and depend on this steady, reliable man. One day, without warning, the dog barked twice. Jim signaled that a frenzy was about to begin. Without hesitation, he locked the door. Agonizing screams soon echoed from inside. Melanie's heart felt as though it was being torn apart, but all she could do was wait quietly by the door, hoping for the worst to pass. Dan stepped in to take over the watch, perhaps one of the benefits of having another capable adult in the house. But no one expected what happened next. Jim's little sister, who had been playing outside, suddenly collapsed. Melanie realized it was a heart attack. With their limited medical resources, there was nothing they could do. Dan suggested following Jim's path and infecting the girl with the virus, but Melanie firmly refused. Jim's survival had been a rare miracle, and even he had suffered greatly to endure it. In the end, they chose to let her pass peacefully. After Jim emerged from his frenzy, the family gathered to say their final goodbyes. Dan knew it was time for him to leave. Despite heartfelt pleas from both Melanie and Jim, he resolutely set off to continue his journey north to find his wife. With 2 people gone, the villa felt suddenly emptier and colder. Not far away, deep in the forest, Whitebeard's men stumbled upon a car Jack had once hidden. The discovery felt almost too perfect to be a coincidence. The couple who had once tried to take over the villa were exactly the people Whitebeard had been desperately searching for. The closest residence to the car was Melanie's villa, so Whitebeard decided to search there next. Meanwhile, Dan, sleeping in the snow, was abruptly awakened by the sound of footsteps. When the noise faded, he stepped outside to find a trail of footprints leading straight toward the villa. A deep sense of unease washed over him as he quickly made his way back. From a distance, he saw the villa swarmed with militia. Whitebeard was there, pressing Melanie for the whereabouts of his daughter after his men had found a small item she had dropped. Melanie was cornered, unable to deny anything. On the other side of the property, Dan quietly slipped past the guards and managed to sneak into the villa. He found Jim hiding in the kitchen, and after learning how many enemies were inside, Dan drew his weapon. Like a shadow of death, he swiftly took down the militia one by one. When he reached the main hall, several guns were suddenly pressed against his head. His next move left everyone stunned. He slashed his own neck with a knife. The room froze in shock, but Melanie instantly understood his intention. Using the chaos, she took Jim and slipped out of the hall. Moments later, Dan fully succumbed to his frenzy. Like an unstoppable force, he tore through Whitebeard and his men. This time, Melanie hadn't tied him up beforehand, so all she could do was flee the villa with her son. Dan's furious roars drew hordes of zombies to the villa. By the next morning, he awoke to find the place completely destroyed. On the table lay a letter from Melanie. She and Jim had already driven north. If fate allowed, perhaps they would meet again someday. Smiling faintly, Dan picked up the doll Jim loved most, slung it over his shoulder, and continued his journey northward.